It is the latest fight over transgender rights.
Two rallies, two opposing messages in downtown Nashville tonight.
I will do everything that I can do at the federal level to make certain that we protect our children.
State Representative Elizabeth Guzman's proposal would make it a crime for parents who do not affirm their children's gender identity.
Protesters in Texas rallying against alleged child abuse investigations targeting parents of transgender youth.
Radical gender theory has progressed rapidly from the assertion that sex and gender are two different things, one biological and one socialized, to some asserting that biological sex is either not real or on a spectrum.
We introduce some people who are called detransitioners. These are people who are choosing to reverse the process.
Hormones do have implications. They have long-term effects, and they have, and of course, surgery has lifelong effects. They're not reversible.
Medical experts, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, say gender-affirming care is safe and best practice for transgender patients.
NHS advising doctors not to encourage children to change their names and pronouns.
To everyone celebrating Transgender Day of Visibility, I want you to know that your president sees you.
And it's okay to ask questions about something that's very new and involves children. The answer can't always be that anyone from a marginalized community is automatically right, trump card, mic drop, end of discussion. Because we're literally experimenting on children.
So the puzzle is, why, out of nowhere in the last decade, have we seen a sudden and sharp spike of teenage girls who have no childhood history of gender dysphoria suddenly deciding they're trans, often with their girlfriends?
The best way that I can describe dysphoria is one night I remember having a dream that I was a boy. I felt so happy after waking up from that dream. It just felt like I was excited to be alive. And then I got up and went and looked in the mirror, and just that happiness was like crushed.
So as a child, I was somewhat gender nonconforming. When I was really little, I used to dress up in my dad's clothes. But things didn't get really bad until puberty, and then I just started to feel very uncomfortable in my body, very uncomfortable with the changes that were happening.
Ever since I was as young as I can remember, I'd always had an issue with my identity, mostly the way that I looked, talked, dressed. I think it got into my head growing up I would be happier if I was a woman. I would be more satisfied with myself if I was a woman. I would love myself more if I was a different person.
As a child, what I didn't know, I didn't call it internalized homophobia because I didn't know the term for it. But that's when I started noticing the stigma over homosexuality. I recognized the guilting, the shaming of same-sex attraction within society and culture alone.
So my whole growing up, from a very small tomboy child until I was almost about 30 years old, I thought that I was what we used to call a transsexual.
It was from the age of around about 3, and it just didn't feel right in my brain. What the hell am I, a girl? Something's gone wrong here, like, because this doesn't make sense. I remembered that very, very intense feeling, and it lasted for many years. And I remember how difficult it was to pull out of it, and how humiliated I felt when I realized with the shock I was stuck with my body.
When I was was about 15, I started really getting into like self-expression, and I sort of opened up out of this sort of depressed shell I was in. But with that identity expression came exploration of gender identities, which I learned about on Tumblr and at school in the Gay Straight Alliance Club.
Just starting to get on social media in 2008, and specifically I was on Tumblr, and that's probably the very first time I ever heard the term transgender and had an idea of what this concept of gender identity meant. I felt like it answered questions. It answered the question, why was I being bullied when I was in elementary school? Oh, it must have been because I was transgender. Why didn't I like dresses? Why didn't I want to wear makeup like when every other little girl did? Stuff like that. I was just like, oh, all of this is because I'm transgender. Like, so many of my friends are starting to identify as transgender and are starting to transition, and it feels like something that is really, it's catching fire.
Roughly 2013, 2014, one after the next teenager was announcing a trans identification in numbers that greatly exceeded what would be expected. And it was apparent that these kids were all from the same friendship group.
This has been documented not only at clinics in the United States, but also across Europe, a several thousand% increase in teenage girls in particular. The ratio now is about 80% girls, 20% boys with gender dysphoria.
So then when I was 13, I was browsing the web one day and I found a forum for female to male people, and it had tips on how to pass. It had people telling their stories of transitioning and saying that they'd had chest surgery, that they used to have female genitals and now they had male genitals, and just the way they were talking about it, they made it sound like it was entirely possible to change sex.
Now just know, like, how truly easy it is for you to go and get treatment if you live in an area with informed consent treatment. I literally made an appointment with a doctor's office in Chicago. I live in Indiana. So I drove up to Chicago. I went to a doctor's appointment that I had set up for 2 weeks prior. Like, it was very quick. And then that day I received estrogen.
I don't think that many people know that young people can walk into a Planned Parenthood in many different states and just walk out with hormones. But the Planned Parenthoods are operating on what's called an informed consent model. And if they sign a piece of paper saying that they acknowledge the risks, then they can be given these powerful hormones with irreversible side effects.
I attended a support group for people who were thinking about whether or not they wanted to transition. And within that group, I did get a lot of useful information. How shall we say it? In retrospect, a lot of that information was really ideological and it wasn't necessarily true. Ultimately, the two therapists that were running that group were both transgender. And one day they said, we have this clinic that's sort of down the road. Their resident doctors are looking for patients that their resident doctors are looking for transgender patients. They want experience with transgender patients. So I saw one of those therapists for probably about an hour, and he wrote a letter recommending testosterone for me.
The therapist said, I'm automatically transgender, and she does not want to gatekeep me on anything. And she had my letter to transition right away. after my first session with her.
My parents took me to a gender therapist, and what I think they thought would happen is that this person would work with me on my gender issues, maybe get to the root cause, and maybe I would end up being trans, maybe not. But what happened is they took me to this person and he affirmed my trans identity within 2 appointments, really the first appointment, and I think it was the 3rd appointment that he suggested I start testosterone. My voice started to drop, which excited me because I'd always wanted to be able to sing lower notes. For the first couple of months being on testosterone, I did think it was the right decision. I felt very energetic, almost euphoric. I enjoyed the changes that were happening to my body at first.
At first, it was a positive thing that I had this label of like androgyny and being genderqueer.
The first few years, it was novel. It was very interesting. All these changes happening to my body. They were things that I was okay with, that I was happy with at that time.
Hey guys, it's Ren. Today is October 8th, 2010, and I'm 1 week on testosterone.
I'm 7 weeks on testosterone, a little over 10 weeks on testosterone.
I would say I had a 99.9% chance that I was never going to regret this.
There was definitely a honeymoon phase. In the beginning of hormone therapy, everything felt great. My body felt great, my mind felt clear. I was also becoming an internet influencer pretty quickly. I am 5 months on hormones, about 5.5 months. And since my last update, there have been a lot of changes. So as many of you know, I take estrogen shots, but this one is particularly important because once I put it into my body, I will be 6 months on estrogen. Sometimes you never think that the things in life that you want are going to happen eventually. It turned out to make me more dysphoric. It turned out to make me uncomfortable. The more that happened to my body, the scareder I got, and I came to the realization that I don't feel like I'm actually transgender. A hell of a realization to have.
At around 2.5, 3 months, I started to notice some concerning side effects. I'm not sure if this was from the binding or the testosterone or both, but I started to have heart palpitations that were happening almost daily. I also felt nauseous and sick to my stomach a lot of the time, which wasn't normal for me. I gained about 20 pounds in a relatively short period of time, and it felt like I had edema in my body, which is swelling up of fluid. My face looked very puffy, and so did the rest of my body, and that made me dysphoric as well. Not only was my voice lower, but it was uncomfortable and painful to speak and sing.
Because of the estrogen, I had severe bone loss. First it was osteopenia, and then it turned into osteoporosis, and the bone loss was severe. So severe, I was hunched over, couldn't stand up straight, walking with a walker.
The transition didn't help. It actually made things worse for me physically, mentally, and socially. The testosterone really worsened my mental health, depression, mood swings, anger issues, social issues. I lost a lot of friends because I was, in a bad mental state.
I had cognitive dissonance with my biology education when I was taking testosterone because, there was a part of me that knew it was probably really bad for me based on what I had learned, but I didn't want to think about that. I just, if something seems too good to be true, it usually is, and that's kind of what it was with medical transition for me.
If it was a solution, if it worked, if it on some level it appeased people and it made them feel so much better, I'd be very open to it. But I've met way too many people, way too many detransitioners who said, I was constantly trying to fight against the onslaught of nature. I was always fighting against it with the hormones I was taking. As somebody said, it's like putting diesel in the petrol tank.
So it's often said that puberty blockers are reversible, but this, I think, is disingenuous on multiple levels. So the first is that the majority of children who are started on puberty blockers, over 95%, go on to take cross-sex hormones. Because they are the first step in sequential treatment pathway, puberty blockers cannot be considered a standalone intervention. So the way the Endocrine Society breaks this down, they state very clearly that estrogen for males carries a very high risk of blood clots and then a moderate risk of breast cancer, heart disease, stroke, gallstones, and elevated triglycerides, which are a type of cholesterol. And then right from the same document, they list the risks of testosterone for females, very high risk of thickening of the blood, and then a moderate risk of severe liver dysfunction, heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure, and breast or uterine cancer. The fact they're being offered outside of clinical trials, despite the fact there's so much unknown about long-term risk, is a scandal in and of itself. Something that has not gotten a lot of attention, but I think will in the coming years, is the psychological impact of being told by people in positions of authority, physicians in particular, that these interventions would improve that person's mental health, and then coming to discover that not only did the intervention not improve that person's mental health, but there actually was no evidence to begin with that it ever would.
Trans people, some of them, once they became trans-identified, they really felt like, I can't be comfortable in my body, I can't have a relationship, say, I can't let anyone touch me until I've transitioned. So they became very kind of fixated on medical transition as the thing that would make them feel comfortable in their body. But in fact, that didn't happen. And so it's almost like the gender dysphoria moves around. At first, it's like focused on the voice, and then they take testosterone and the voice deepens, but then it's like, well, then they have chest dysphoria and they want to get rid of their breasts, and then they have a mastectomy and it still doesn't work.
That is the road of transition. It's this always looking for the next solution, the next solution.
That's why when I first transitioned, I wanted to give myself a timeline. I broke one of them. The first one was wait 5 years once I transitioned to get breast implants. And that's the one I broke.
Double mastectomy is definitely one of the worst mistakes that I've made. Like, I have an absurd body because it doesn't look female, but it also doesn't look male. And now that I view myself as just a woman who had medical trauma, I don't view it as like a trans man's chest. I view it as like surgical scars and like weirdly shaped nipples and a form of mutilation. I know some people don't like that term. I do view it as mutilation. I do view it as sort of unnecessary medical carnage.
Sit forward a bit, just leave your feet on the thing there. This way you can start looking at the journals.
Okay. So I haven't made a vlog in a really long time. Just because, I don't know, I've been busy, things have been happening. But I did want to make one, but I was told that I had to make one after I came back from Florida, because I went down to Florida, obviously, to see Dr. Garamoni to do my top surgery. Yeah. I don't know what to say, really.
Nursing was so special for me, and so many women report the same thing. I think it's tragic that there are detransitioners out there who won't be able to nurse their children because they got their breasts removed.
A lot of young people are willing to completely alter their bodies without really understanding the value of having your body intact. Many of these young people have never even experienced a relationship.
It was the hysterectomy that was the worst thing that I had done. Even before I detransitioned, there was a part of me thinking, actually, I do want children now.
When kids say, this doesn't matter to me because what really matters to me is my gender identity, and I'll do anything to affirm my gender identity, and I don't care about having kids, and I don't care about sexual function, it seems to me that it's extremely naive of the adults in that person's life to go along with that, because we know that kids change their minds. And we for this reason, we simply don't perform medical procedures on young people that have a high incidence of regret. For example, it's very difficult to get an elective hysterectomy, let's say, as a 20-something-year-old. Let's say you have 2 kids and you're 25 and you say, I want it out, I want it gone. You're gonna have a hard time finding a doctor to perform that. And that may seem kind of paternalistic, but there is a reason for it, because there's a high incidence of regret, and there's also a lot of medical consequences to getting a hysterectomy. I mean, for one thing, early dementia if you lose your uterus that early in life. The only other time that I can think of that we addressed some psychological problem with a physical intervention was with lobotomies. And, lobotomy was a surgery that was performed that severed the corpus callosum. And it was very popular at the time. It was hailed as a kind of miracle cure. And the person who invented the procedure won a Nobel Prize. But we discovered that these procedures did a lot of damage. And, they fell out of favor pretty shortly after they came on the scene. And now we think of it as pretty barbaric.
And this isn't a fringe thing. We're not talking about 1 or 2 kids here and there. We're talking about tens of thousands of children. Just on GoFundMe alone, right now, there are over 40,000 girls raising money for what they call top surgery, which is the euphemism given for radical elective double mastectomy.
Even though I didn't want it, I never wanted the full surgery. I was contemplating on going to Thailand to get the complete sexual reassignment surgery, which is what they called it then. Now it's called gender affirming surgery. So first I was going to New York to get castrated and to get more work, what we call done, more silicone put in my body. I was on Coney Island with 2 trannies that had already had the complete sexual reassignment surgery. And we're laughing and joking and having a good old time. And then they both looked at me and one of them said, "Don't do it." And I said, "Don't do what?" And he said, "All of my life, I thought that if I could just become a woman, I would find peace and joy and happiness." And he said, "And now that I am legally and medically a woman," he said, "I'm more miserable now than I was my entire life." He said, "I think about taking my life every day." And the other one said, "I think about taking my life several times a day, every day."
There's a current belief system, there's an oversimplification that all gender dysphoria has one cause, which is, being born in the wrong body, and that there's one treatment, which is transition. And you don't ask questions, this is the only way to go.
Based on the information that I had, that medical transition is by far the best treatment and that you are at risk for suicide if you don't follow that path. I thought I only really had one path that I could take.
I became alarmed back in 2019 after I realized I was seeing more kids with gender dysphoria, and every single one I referred to the gender clinic was being transitioned. And so when an average pediatrician sees a kid with gender issues, they're not sure what to do. The whole thing is very complicated. And so they want to refer to the experts. But I do think most pediatricians don't realize that if they send a kid to the gender clinic, the probability of transition is very high, that there's no careful evaluation or differential diagnosis being performed.
Gender affirming care is a misleading phrase. It's a deceptive phrase because it sounds so warm and innocent. But really what it is a departure from the standards of care for how we treat any other condition. And that is that we take the self-diagnosis at face value. So if someone tells us they have gender dysphoria, we say, okay, you have gender dysphoria. If they tell us, I've always felt that way, we say, okay, you've always felt that way. If they say, I'm a boy trapped in a girl's body, we say, you're a boy trapped in a girl's body. So we're just mirroring and reflecting without any questioning, probing, curiosity, without taking a systemic view, and without using really any of our clinical discernment. Normally, as therapists, we do a complete biopsychosocial assessment, and we take the individual in the context of their whole lives. And then we weave what's called a golden thread from the assessment to the treatment plan, and we make sure that the treatment plan that we're proposing is a match.
And so with gender dysphoria, though, it's like all of that goes out the window. And we assume there's a one pathway for treatment. And it just so happens that that one pathway, medicalized transition, involves some really invasive, irreversible interventions.
These doctors and therapists put me through this. They had no reason to, except for the fact that I said it.
The American Academy of Pediatrics issued a new policy statement stating that the affirmative model was the right way, that whatever a child says about him or her or their self, we all affirm and go with, and we don't question. And that review was fact-checked by a sex researcher and psychologist named James Cantor, who was intimately familiar with the research. It had been part of his graduate studies years before. And he fact-checked it and found that some of the assertions made in this policy statement were factually untrue.
Most children who develop gender dysphoria will have resolution of that gender dysphoria by the time they reach adulthood. No one really understands the process or the timing of that resolution, but the studies that we do have show that depending upon study, somewhere between roughly 65 and 98% of children who have gender dysphoria as kids will not have clinically significant gender dysphoria as adults. But this fact seems to be forgotten by medicine currently.
There are certain assumptions in this gender identity affirming model that really need to be examined. And one of them is that teenagers are never wrong about anything. And the assumption that what a teenager wants right now is going to be best for their long-term health and well-being. And if you're building a whole medical model and a medical treatment around those assumptions, I mean, that's pretty shaky ground.
There are two very different narratives about gender. One is the narrative of pathology. So the narrative of pathology says gender dysphoria is a psychiatric illness so severe that it warrants extreme medical treatments, surgeries, and chemicals that are as invasive and extreme as what we would use to treat cancer. On the other hand, the same people advocating for those medical treatments also will tell you that there's nothing pathological about this condition that we might call gender dysphoria. In fact, maybe we shouldn't call it gender dysphoria at all. Maybe we should just call it gender incongruence. If you look at the criteria for how gender dysphoria is described in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it's really just a list of stereotypes and then someone saying that they feel like they don't fit these stereotypes or that they're uncomfortable in the body that they have. So what's wrong with that is that you're recommending some invasive, risky, experimental, and costly medical treatments for something that you're saying is not a medical condition.
And so it's the medical model jumping in on what you could call a cultural zeitgeist of people pushing back against gender norms. And put the two together, and we've got an awful lot of children who want to medically transition. It's not right to medicalize perfectly healthy bodies and make them sicker.
People don't realize now is that any of these words, particularly if a kid says that they're non-binary or trans or any of these other identities, these kids are looking to have like a tattoo of some sort to prove to others, which means they want to be medicalized somehow so they can say, I'm on E, I'm on T.
And if we as professionals are not able to hold space for this being an exploratory thing that teenagers do, and professionals are actually kind of rubber stamping the identity and encouraging kids to medically transition, this is really the potential of a serious epidemic of medical interventions that are probably going to be inappropriate for many of these kids. It seems like all of this is based on the fear that if you don't affirm a child's identity right away, they're going to be at a high risk of suicide.
We're living in an age where there's the whole do you want a dead daughter or a live son thing going on, right? And parents are being intimidated and coerced into, if you don't affirm right away, your kid's going to commit suicide. Well, that's a really dangerous thing to tell people.
There's a real dereliction of duty and irresponsible behaviors that people have been misrepresenting the data on suicide.
All of the clinicians that are actually tracking current rates of self-harm and suicide will tell you, luckily, the suicide rate is quite low. And it's not a legitimate outcome. And that we don't know medicalizing reduces suicide.
You know, doctors have really been transmitting this information in a forceful, authoritative way. Puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones will provide relief from depression and anxiety and suicidal thoughts and reduce the future risk of suicide, etc. But the reality is that these interventions have not been shown to do those things.
In the United States, there are 22 professional organizations that have lined up behind gender affirmation. And these professional organizations are putting a thumb on the scale, not only by silencing their own members, but by stifling debate in the medical journals. For example, in 2020, the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, called Pediatrics, published a study by Jack Turban, a young psychiatrist, and he basically data mined a massive online survey to try to show that puberty blockers prevent suicides. This is convenient sample data, and it cannot prove any sort of cause and effect. But he made that claim, and it was written up in all the major media. And we found out later that Dr. Turban had received a substantial grant from a drug company that makes puberty blockers. He hadn't disclosed that. When researchers wrote to Pediatrics about all the errors in the study, each of them was told there was no space to publish their rebuttals. You know, an ordinary pediatrician, if he reads any journals at all, it's going to be Pediatrics, right? Because you get it for free. It shows up. Like, it's delivered to your house if you're an AAP member. So, like, and it's supposed to be a really high quality journal, but it is not covering itself in glory on this topic.
The evidence that's most often cited comes from these surveys where they just ask kids about suicidality, and there's lots of problems with that evidence, because of course kids think if you're trans you have to be suicidal. Girls taking testosterone are less likely to express suicidality, which makes sense because actually testosterone is an antidepressant. We know we can use it in men as an antidepressant, but boys taking estrogen are more suicidal. And of course, if the kids believe that this is life-saving medical treatment, you're getting a massive placebo response. I've actually done research on the world's largest youth gender clinic in London, known as the Tavistock, to investigate the actual number of deaths by suicide. Out of 15,000 patients over 10 years, they've had 4 suicides. Now, those are 4 terrible tragedies, of course, but as you can see, suicide, thankfully, is very, very rare. Now, the suicide rate for these patients is higher than the overall population, perhaps 5 or 6 times higher, but we can't conclude that this elevated risk is directly related to transgender identity, because many of these kids have other psychological conditions that we know increase the risk of suicide, like depression, eating disorders, and autism. The crucial question, of course, is whether puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones reduce or increase the actual risk of suicide. And the honest answer is that we just don't know because we lack good quality evidence. For what it's worth, of the 4 suicides at the Tavistock, 2 came from patients on the waiting list and 2 from patients undergoing treatment. So there's no evidence that taking cross-sex hormones reduces the risk of suicide.
It's just not true that these kids are more likely to complete a suicide if they're not given these interventions. And in fact, there was a study looking at the Swedish population of those who had transitioned that found that those who had transitioned had suicide rates 19 times higher than population-matched controls. Now, that's not saying that transition causes suicidality. I mean, there's lots of different ways to understand that. And I don't know that we can draw hard and fast conclusions from that number, but I think it certainly tells us that transition doesn't prevent suicide.
To me, the scariest part of it is the idea that you could cut a parent out of a child's life because the parent is hesitant to socially or medically transition.
What therapists are doing in the affirmative model is to take all threat of suicide at face value and treat all threats of suicide as equally valid without assessing all the things we normally assess when it comes to suicidality, like plan, means, and intent, right? Youth will be sent or taken to hospitals, sometimes by their parents who are desperate and don't know what else to do and are afraid. And then the hospitals will keep the kids and fail to assess their complete mental health picture and keep the kids until the parents agree to affirm. And I've seen cases of this happening where I know that if it were about any other issue, people at the hospital would have been able to assess, you know, this is passive suicidal ideation. It's not active. They don't have a plan. They don't have a means. They don't have an intent. It's just a distressing thought. It's our responsibility to believe in our patients' capacity for resilience, even and especially when they don't believe in it themselves. We should never tell anyone under any circumstances that if you don't get what you want or if you don't get what you think is the solution to your problems, you will kill yourself. That's really damaging. I would call that malpractice.
I knew there was something more than just depression and anxiety and autism. I felt like there was something else. And initially I thought that something else was filled by gender dysphoria.
I think that being sexually assaulted absolutely contributed to my gender dysphoria getting stronger and wanting to be a woman even less.
I was diagnosed with ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, traits of borderline personality disorder, traits of post-traumatic stress from childhood bullying.
I had suffered from an eating disorder. I had had a suicide attempt.
Around the time I was 11 or 12, I developed anorexia nervosa. And then years later, it led me to develop body dysmorphia, which I falsely, wrongly attributed to being gender dysphoria.
So it was easy for me to be like, I'm mentally ill and depressed and weird and androgynous. Actually, I'm mentally ill, weird, depressed, androgynous, and trans, and I need to be a gay man, and that's how I'll be loved and accepted by everybody that I love and want to love me, and that's how that started.
Once a kid identifies as trans or describes gender dysphoria, all of the other conditions that they were struggling with before become attributed to the distress of being trans.
Sometimes it's even seen if you facilitate transition, these other issues will resolve themselves. As we know, because we've seen it, that doesn't happen.
A study in the Tavistock, which is the largest gender clinic for children in the world, and they showed 48% of those children presenting seeking to medicalize their identity were autistic. And I remember talking to one teenager. And we were discussing how testosterone is very hard on the female body. And she said, yeah, I'm very well aware of that, and it's really bad on the female body, but it's okay for me because, you see, I'm really male. And she didn't realize, no, we have physical limitations with our body, and you have been frankly lied to believe that what's in your mind is actually impacting the chromosomes in your body and the cells in your body. They're not.
I've spoken with probably 100 parents of children with autism. They all tell me the same things, that their children tend to think more black and white, and they tend to fixate on this issue of gender when they've been introduced to it in school or online. And so once this ideology's already gotten in their head, it can be a lot harder to reach them.
There can be a lot of anxiety in people with autism because they have the same feelings as the rest of us. They're just not able to interpret what all's happening to trigger those feelings. They already know there's something different about them. They've probably been bullied for being different, and that's very painful. The autistic mind also loves a nice concrete black and white narrative that explains everything. And again, that can leave them susceptible to an ideology that says, here's why you feel different, here's why you feel bad and awkward. And here's a solution. Here's your comprehensive plan, step by step, for what you should do next.
These teenagers are very, very influenced by the most alluring concept that I've ever heard, which is if you take these drugs, you can be somebody different with a different name, and nobody will be able to mention or even refer to that old, awkward, lost kid. Nobody will be able to refer to them. You can be this new, remarkably like that person on YouTube, new, sunny, social kind of butterfly person. And that is at the end of the rainbow if you just medically transition. That's in your power.
Because a lot of these kids are very intellectually curious and they tend to be, open-minded, wonderful kids, they say, I want to learn better about this. I want to understand this better. And they'll begin to research it, or perhaps they have a friend who's recently identified as trans, and that friend may explain it to them. And so it's interesting. It's almost like playing a game of telephone, because it seems to be very peer-led. Like even the kids who have been doing a lot of research online, when you ask what kind of research have you been doing, they're watching other YouTube videos by other teenagers or young people.
They go onto the internet and they say something like, I hate my body. I don't want to be me. I want to be something else. And with those questions, they end up with, you could be trans, you could transition.
The idea that being trans is a mental illness doesn't make any sense to me.
because you're intellectually stimulated.
There's so many things that came up. I'm like, passion. Now I'm doing this, which is thank God, because like I said, I honestly, I need to get that chaos out some way.
I just think that in these situations, therapists might be naive to what's going on in these friend groups and to some of the messages that these kids are seeing from their friends and online.
When we think about the suggestibility of a young person, we can't rule out that perhaps they've adopted and absorbed some of these ideas from the kind of literature that they're looking at and the videos that they're looking at. So the things that lead kids to identify as trans are very, very specific for each case, but in terms of how they came to that decision and how they began to feel that way, at least in the new cohort that we're looking at, it really seems to be socially mediated.
And these ideas are highly contagious because they appeal to so many of the things that we long for. They provide the kind of illusory hope that there's a way out of normal human struggles like the discomfort of puberty. When you engage in this belief system, it tends to be worse for your mental health. You tend to get worse, but there's this carrot dangling that when I achieve the next level of transition, then I'll feel euphoric. I feel dysphoric now. I'm depressed, I'm anxious, but I'm going to feel gender euphoria when I get this. When I socially transition, when I go through this or that medical transition, when I get my binder, when I pass, when I, and that is part of what makes it so contagious too, is that you don't have to find out right away that this belief system isn't leading anywhere good, because there's always something to hope for.
I said what I said, and boy, I heard what you said. My God, how could I not?
I think that it's very difficult to reconcile this as an identity human rights issue and an issue that needs really drastic medical intervention. Those things don't make so much sense when you try to hold them together.
It's the one belief about yourself that you can never question. It's almost gender has become a sacred category.
I think they have been overtaken with a kind of religious fervor that has blinded them to reality.
I really think that a lot of it, though, does tie back to how the trans rights movement has co-opted the gay rights movement.
When we trace back the gay rights movement and how suddenly the T kind of jumped in on something that was about sexual orientation, we'll realize in the 1970s there was a great concept which was born this way. And so that people who are gay and lesbian and bisexual, they were saying we're born this way. And it was a really strong campaign. And since then we've made huge inroads, and I'm delighted we have, into a massive acceptance of people being gay and lesbian and bisexual. And from that, I can only say with an incredible level of strategic thinking, the LGBT movement started talking about born in the wrong body. So they moved from born this way in the 1970s to born in the wrong body in the noughties.
From what we can tell at this point is that they were experimenting, and predominantly that I can tell along the West Coast, San Francisco, Los Angeles, the whole West Coast. Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, lesbian communities were all, and we were all reporting these changes that our communities were disappearing. So they were literally transing the gay away.
So we know, for example, that Jazz Jennings has never had an orgasm. So that is an extraordinary thing for someone who is born male to be 20 and never have had an orgasm. And it looks as though that won't ever be possible for Jazz. So when you realize that most of the young kids who get gender dysphoria will eventually desist, and this is what the evidence tells us, and that most of those who desist will then be lesbian or gay, what we may be doing actually is sterilizing and destroying the sexual function of kids who may have grown up to be gay or lesbian.
You can't even have a boy now pick up a doll without right away some other adult saying, oh, look, he's cute. Is your kid trans? I'm a child of the 50s. This stuff that people are doing now to their kids, that like the stuff with Chaz Jennings, I can't believe how absolutely regressive this is. That's what's so insane about this. They've managed to actually brainwash people to thinking that affirmation is a progressive thing.
People want to be good people. The expectation is that if you're a good person, then you believe what someone tells you if they are a minority or a victim.
Whenever they're talking about, you know, you're trying to take away trans rights, it's like they're there. The protections are there. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that the oppression of otherness doesn't still happen. That's why this whole thing with the LGBT was so attractive to this wider audience of basically white kids that, you know, had other luxuries, privilege, and guilt, and this sense of, well, what's going to make me special?
The fact that things are so polarized politically is really unfortunate, because for those of us speaking out who have always historically been very, very progressive, open-minded people, are demonized as though we're closed-minded, and that's why we are speaking out about this.
MSNBC, CNN, I mean, they're not going to talk about all the parents that have been protesting at the clinics. I had over 13 protests last year, nationwide, in front of pediatric gender clinics. I contacted the press all the time. Nobody came out.
Who would believe those of us speaking out, right? These kind of fringe lefties. Who believes the parents? Who believes the few journalists on the left saying it? Who believes the researchers who object? And who believes them when the vast majority of people do not feel safe to speak up? And that's the other issue, right? If you object to this internally, you want to stay connected to your kids, you want to keep your friends, you want to keep your job, you can't say anything. And that environment was created by the left to silence dissent from within the left. And it's been very effective. That same week, you have people who are writing the standards of care sitting on a panel saying it's okay to call CPS on parents who are not affirming. Our side is not doing anything to de-escalate either. So I want liberals to help us de-escalate this from culture war to conversation. And in order to do that, we need to admit that some children are getting hurt, even if some are getting helped. And we need to look honestly at what is going on in countries with better healthcare systems.
the big news stories overnight, the NHS to close the UK's only dedicated gender identity clinic for children and young people.
NHS England has announced the closure of its controversial gender identity clinic for children after an independent report found it was not fit for purpose.
They too saw a 4,000% increase in teen girls seeking care, and they hired a pediatrician named Hilary Cass to write a report. We don't have the final report, we have the interim report, and it diagnosed the system with a problem, including things like diagnostic overshadowing, which means that once a kid is identified as having gender issues, all of his or her other issues are ignored.
The kids that Tavistock sees have many other problems. They have very high rates of autistic spectrum disorders, self-harm, depression, anxiety, all of these sorts of things. And those things aren't dealt with because there's this weird way that as soon as somebody says gender, they don't do anything else.
So when you have a population with multiple mental health comorbidities, and only the gender dysphoria is being treated with the assumption that the other issues will go away, what you have is kids getting very, very poor treatment.
And the second problem is that the Tavistock has this hugely ideological approach. It hasn't been doing good medicine, it hasn't been keeping records, it hasn't been doing proper research, it hasn't been investigating the reasons behind a child's trans identity. They've just been assuming that a child who says, I'm trans, is trans, and putting them on these very poorly researched pathways with puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones.
Multiple European countries have conducted systematic evidence reviews, found that the evidence could not confirm that this was medically necessary or life-saving treatment, and have issued very strict guidelines so that children are very carefully evaluated before medically transitioning. And some of these countries have urged against social transition, since it appears from preliminary research that social transition generally leads to medical transition.
The U.S. is getting more out of step with the rest of the world every day. There are several progressive countries, that the ones that pioneered pediatric gender transition, and they are reconsidering what they've been doing. Sweden was the first country to recognize, the legal status of trans people, and they just issued new guidelines where they say gender transitioning of minors should only be done for exceptional cases and in tightly controlled clinical studies. And there are no studies going on right now. Finland did the similar thing 2 years ago. In the last 12 months, we've heard from the French Academy of Medicine, the Australian psychiatrists, and the Italian psychoanalysts, all expressing concern. So all of these changes, or at least in Sweden, Finland, and England, followed a commissioned systematic review of the evidence, which found either no benefits to youth gender transitions or even that the harms outweighed the benefits.
The U.S. is refusing, the American Academy of Pediatrics is refusing to do a systematic evidence review. So is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. They also wrote in their recently released guidelines that they could not conduct a systematic evidence review because the research is so scant. That is not true. Other countries did them. The state of Florida did them. They all came to the same conclusion.
The American Academy of Pediatrics National Conference and Exhibition is being held this year in Anaheim, California. With over 10,000 doctors attending, a group took the opportunity to come as well.
So the way the American Academy of Pediatrics is supposed to represent the 66,000 pediatricians that are the members is via this thing called an annual leadership forum. Members can submit resolutions, and then the membership can read them and vote on them online, but the binding vote is made at the leadership forum, which is just people who are chapter presidents and heads of committees and things like that. I submitted a resolution in 2020, and it was largely ignored. But then another pediatrician submitted a resolution in 2021 calling for a systematic review of the evidence behind pediatric gender transition. And that, because of the pandemic, They had it online and it got a lot of engagement. It was in the top 5 in terms of pediatrician engagement, and it was 4-to-1 positive versus negative votes. And then in 2022, they were so concerned that that sort of thing might happen again that in March, they passed a new rule saying that unsponsored resolutions could not be seen by the rank and file pediatricians. So I did submit another resolution in 2022. There were 4 other pediatricians who co-authored it with me, but it got buried. Nobody could give it a yes or no vote, and very few could even read it. So it's important to realize that when we hear 22 professional organizations support affirmation, this is not the voice of the average pediatrician. It's the position of a few activists that have captured key committees at these medical societies and are using the bureaucracy to ensure the voice of regular pediatricians isn't heard.
While other countries are walking back the affirmative approach to treating gender dysphoria, the United States is digging in its heels. And why that is something of a mystery, but all we can do is speculate that A, there's tremendous profit in it, and there isn't in these other countries, and B, people have invested so much psychologically in this narrative that they have to do everything they can to protect it, even if it involves harming children and families.
The parallels between what's occurring now with gender dysphoria and these interventions of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, it bears some resemblance to what happened with the opioid epidemic. With that epidemic, physicians were told that a new opioid had been developed that was not addictive. That simply was not true. There was no evidence to support that. There were no safeguards in place around the prescribing of opioids, and we're all now painfully aware of the consequence of that.
But I was hanging outside of bars with friends of mine, my friends, very butch, we hung out, we smoked outside and everything. We got approached. There was this metrosexual guy that came around. I don't know if he was a big pharma rep. I assume that that's probably what was going on. And he had a whole bunch of these things that looked like this. He was handing out for free and telling all of these young lesbians, I got something you want. I got something you need. I'm like, what is that? And he said testosterone, and he yelled back like that. I didn't put it all together. Again, this is at a time in the 90s. It wasn't until Jennifer Billick's article came out in February of 2018 in the Federalist, which was a publication I never would have looked at otherwise, but there it was. Who were the wealthy white men behind transgenderism?
I don't think drugs and puberty blockers and surgeries have anything to do with a sense of one's identity. I think that's all propaganda. It's corporate propaganda to go along with this corporate illusion. they're selling a product and they do a really, really good job. And young people, they're buying it. They're just buying it.
What people don't realize now is that if they get those puberty blockers and they're pushing for it to be younger and younger, because the younger the child is that's put on puberty blockers first, then they go to wrong sex hormones, their secondary sex characteristics can be a little bit more tricky. And the medical industry loves that because they got to keep that going. Because again, as Jennifer Bilek talks about all these markets opening up, we got to keep those drugs coming for a lifetime in order to keep that body, because it will fight forever. The natural DNA in our bodies will fight forever against those poisons that are literally being put in that body.
It's also part of the profiteering package because you're sterilizing a whole segment of the next generation who will, if they decide that they want to have children later, will need the techno-medical complex on the reproductive technology side. From like 2014 until now, it's everywhere. It's in our governments, not just one government, but all Western societies. They're changing their laws, they're changing their language, they're changing their institutions. If you go fill out a form at your doctor's office, suddenly there's more than male or female. People are being compelled to take this on, to invest in this as something that's real, even though it's in the mind. And the past 2 years has really accentuated that process by everybody being on technology and isolated in their own little bubbles. I mean, for people to think that this is just an organic development is startling to me. It's absolutely startling that people haven't even grasped this much, that this is really off.
What's up, my beautiful people? How are we doing today? If you've been around my channel for a minute, then you know that I am male to female to male. So I went through transition, and then after about 9 months, I came to the realization that I'm not transgendered.
I was living with a friend of mine who also identified as transgender at that time. But in 2020, he decided to detransition. So before that, he was trying to show me the detrans subreddit and all of these people's stories. And I wouldn't look at it because I thought that they were all bigots that just wanted to take away trans healthcare. But as soon as I decided, I think all of this was a mistake, then I was just suddenly open to reading all those things. And I started just reading constantly and constantly. Over the next few years, I did think a lot about, I was, again, reframing my life in the context of me being autistic and having ADHD. And suddenly me being bullied as a child made a lot more sense. me not wanting to fit gender roles made a lot more sense, not understanding that this is what girls are supposed to do and, not being able to fit in. Those all kind of made sense. Those are things that were because I was autistic. They weren't because I was transgender. And so I was spending all that time chasing something that ultimately I was never going to be able to achieve anyway, because if you live as someone who has transitioned, you're spending the rest of your life either denying your own material reality or trying to convince other people that they need to deny your material reality in order for you to be comfortable in society.
Just naturally, I found my way to like radical feminist materials online. And I saw the links between trauma and trans identification. And I started talking to detransitioners, just a very small group. And I realized that, yeah, it was all due to trauma and nothing had changed and I wasn't really any different and I wasn't any better off. The worst part is that I sort of learned that I could have just dealt with it.
Everyone that knew me, they would have argued with anybody that Paige was content and secure and happy and just being the person she was meant to be. And none of them had a clue that I was depressed, that I was bitter, that I hated myself, that I attempted to take my life quite a few times. Even the young queens that looked up to me, that would come and stay at my apartment, they didn't know that. And then come to now, when I think back, and I'm like, wow, how many of them felt the same way? I recognize that I didn't just live a lie. I became the lie. I was the lie.
Some people detransition because they faced persecution as being trans, but in recent studies, most detransitioners, I believe the number is 60%, detransitioned because they found that they were able to align with their birth sex.
Why do they detransition? Most commonly, they say exhaustion. They're tired out. They're sick of trying to be somebody that they don't feel they actually are.
This was a study of 100 individuals who detransitioned. For this study, I reached out to communities with varied perspectives. So on the one hand, I shared information on the listservs of WPATH and APA, which are organizations that tend to be pro-medical transition. And I also shared information on detransition forums and detransition private groups or social media. And in those communities, the belief that transition is universally beneficial may be less common. The most frequently endorsed reason for detransitioning in my study was that their personal definition of male or female changed, so they became comfortable identifying as their natal sex. Another reason that individuals detransitioned was that they were concerned about medical complications, or they found that their mental health either did not improve or worsened with transition. Some detransitioners were dissatisfied with the physical effects of transition, either that the changes in their body was either too much or too little. Some individuals detransitioned because they discovered that their gender dysphoria was caused by trauma or a mental health condition. And some individuals detransitioned because they felt discriminated against while they were transitioned. Another reason that came up, this was really interesting because I did not have any questions about it. Individuals reported that having difficulty accepting themselves as lesbian, gay, or bisexual was associated with their gender dysphoria and desire to transition. Finally accepting themselves was related to detransitioning. Of the 100 detransitioners that participated in the study, less than a quarter informed the clinicians that facilitated their transitions that they had detransitioned. So it's likely that individuals who are facilitating transitions are missing most of this population. One of the surprising things that I found in meeting detransitioners is the hostility that they face for just sharing their own experiences.
I'd been told by trans activists that detransitioners were extremely rare and that a lot of them were transphobic and that I shouldn't listen to them.
It's lonely enough being a detransitioner and not having the support of a group of friends that you could go out and have fun with, right? Like when you were in that movement.
In July of 2020, I started realizing that hormone therapy was no longer having a satisfactory effect on my mental health and my physical health. But now at this point in time, I had a lot of social media followers, people that looked up to me and made me feel like I was important to them. And I felt like I couldn't go back and that the only option was to just keep pushing forward, which led me to spiral into a state of depression and being admitted to a psychiatric hospital.
So Jung coined the term shadow to refer to any part of us that we actually don't want to know about. And one of the things that I've thought about is that detransitioners carry the shadow for people. They are absolutely a shadow group. People don't want to know that they exist. People demonize them. They feel isolated. When they detransition, they often lose friends. They often have to hide, maybe even, that they're detrans, because they hold this thing that we don't want to know about. They hold this thing that we don't want to know about, that this experiment that we're all engaged in might not work for everyone.
When I referred to those years as being the lost years, is because I feel like I have very little memory of what happened or why I was thinking the way that I did. All those years that I wasted, really.
Like I said, I have to now live with what I've done.
I turned to professionals, doctors, and I was not helped. I was just ushered along, very mindlessly. And I had permanent damage because of it.
That's what I hear. I have ruined my life. I've ruined my body. I've ruined my health. I had a perfectly good body, and now it's ruined. And I've heard that, repeatedly from detransitioners, and it's a horrible feeling.
These vulnerable people were treated incredibly badly by the professionals. They were failed very badly because people told them that they could have an easier life if they transitioned, and it turned out to be a much more difficult life. People who've fallen in with the principle of first do no harm have actually harmed young, vulnerable people to an incomprehensible degree.
Clinicians, we've been sold a bill of lies, and I honestly feel for all my colleagues who are still doing the affirmation thing, who really think that they're doing the right thing. They really think they're on the right side of history. I understand that. That's going to come crashing down at some point, and it's going to be really hard to reckon with what they've done. Same with the teachers, doctors, and parents.
We're rushing to make a permanent medical transformation. I can't think of anything that I've seen in my time as a therapist that is more terrifying and destructive. I don't know what the long-term impact will be.
You know, wisdom is born from suffering. And the detransitioners that I've worked with are some of the wisest young people I've ever met.
I think we need to let kids have that identity exploration and then allow them to develop a prefrontal cortex so then they can have long-term planning and decision-making and sort of, you know, just grow up, just evolve.
I don't think it's something that children should choose at all because, you know, as a 22-year-old, I didn't have all of the pieces of my life together at that time. I couldn't predict who I wanted to be 10 years in the future. At 22, can you imagine a child at the age of 10 deciding that, you know, who they want to be for the rest of their life?
It's just okay to be different. And sometimes it's just not always black and white as to why you feel the way that you feel. And that we aren't the horrible things that happen to us when we're young kids.
I don't believe that anyone is born in the wrong body. I think that the goal of treatment for gender dysphoria should be self-acceptance. And in addition to that, I would like to see society move towards being more accepting of LGBT and gender non-conforming people. Because I feel like what pushes people to medically transition a lot of times is trauma that they've faced from society not accepting them for who they are.
I think that's probably one of my biggest goals, is to make young people understand that you can just be gay and it's okay.
It's up to us on the left to ask our politicians, the medical associations, the schools to walk this back and to be honest about the complexity of it. I want liberals to make room for gender diversity, and that includes masculine girls and feminine boys, without telling them that they need to leave their sex category because they are different. I want them to understand that there are many ways to treat gender dysphoria if a child does have it.
Young people are right at that moment in life when they're looking for meaning. That's why, you know, one of the most common novels is a coming of age novel. Coming of age is a time when we discover who we are. It's a time when we grapple with our purpose. And it's a dark time. It's really scary to grapple with a sense of meaning and purpose. We sort of make light of it in a way. It's adolescent angst. But you know, when you're going through it, it doesn't feel like a funny trope. It feels deadly serious. I'm a Jungian analyst, and Jung said that most of our problems are because we've lost a sense of meaning. And I certainly find that in the people that come to me for therapy. So I'm always interested in addressing psychological distress with psychological interventions. And I'm talking about looking at it as a sickness of soul that can be healed with connection, that can be healed with relationship, that can be healed with compassion, that can be healed with understanding, and that can be healed with a confrontation with one's sense of meaning and purpose.